Hi guys, the night air above the Nile was still warm, even long after the sun had disappeared behind the western desert. A slow breeze drifted across the dark water, carrying the smell of wet reeds, river mud, and distant cooking fires that had only recently faded into ash. Most of the village had already gone quiet. Inside small mud brick homes, families rested close together beneath woven linen cloths. Sandals sat near doorways. Clay jars cooled slowly in the darkness. Somewhere far away, a dog barked once, then stopped. The river continued its soft movement through the blackness of the night, calm and patient, just as it had for countless generations. Ancient Egypt often feels distant now. Its temples stand silent beneath the desert sun. Its statues stare outward with still stone faces. But long before the ruins became old, the land beside the Nile was full of ordinary people living careful and balanced lives. Most of them were not kings. Most never saw the inside of a palace. They woke early. They carried water. They repaired fishing nets. They swept dust from floors that filled with sand again by evening. They baked bread before sunrise while the air was still cool enough to work comfortably beside the ovens. And somehow, through endless seasons of heat, floodwater, labor, and exhaustion, Egyptian society remained steady for a very long time. Not perfect. Not easy. But balanced. The balance was everywhere. It existed in the rising and falling river. In the work shared between neighbors. In the quiet routines repeated every morning. In the careful records of scribes. In the grain stored for difficult seasons. In the slow understanding that every person, from farmer to fisherman to temple servant, had a place inside the larger rhythm of the land. The people of Egypt believed deeply in order. Not loud order created by force alone, but a softer kind of order that lived inside everyday life. A balance between people, nature, work, family, and the gods above them. They believed the world itself depended on this balance. And so life moved carefully forward, one season at a time. Far before dawn, while the stars still covered the sky, the first workers often began to stir awake. The nights in Egypt could feel surprisingly cool. Families sleeping on rooftops during the hotter months sometimes pulled thin blankets close against the early morning air. Then slowly, one by one, they woke beneath fading starlight. A mother might rise first. Quietly she moved across the roof or through the small dark rooms below. She relit the cooking fire from warm coals buried beneath ash overnight. The faint orange glow returned slowly, lighting rough walls of dried mud brick. Soon came the soft grinding of grain. This sound existed everywhere in ancient Egypt. Every morning, women knelt beside grinding stones, pushing grain back and forth for long stretches of time. The work was slow and tiring. Fine dust from the flour drifted into the air and settled onto skin, hair, and clothing. Bread was life beside the Nile. Without bread, the balance weakened. So the grain had to be prepared every day. Outside, the eastern horizon slowly brightened into pale blue. Palm trees stood black against the growing light. Somewhere near the riverbank, fishermen untied small wooden boats from reeds and stakes driven into the mud. The Nile itself was already awake. It moved silently through the center of Egyptian life. Wide. Brown. Gentle. Endless. Children learned its moods from an early age. Farmers watched its flood levels carefully. Merchants floated goods upon its waters. Priests performed rituals beside it. Workers washed dust from their bodies in it after long days beneath the sun. The river fed nearly everything. Without the Nile, there would have been only desert. And the Egyptians understood this deeply. The yearly flooding of the Nile brought rich dark soil across the fields. This soil allowed crops to grow in a land otherwise surrounded by dry emptiness. The floodwaters arrived slowly and predictably enough that entire communities organized their lives around them. The rhythm of the river became the rhythm of society itself. There were seasons for planting, seasons for harvest, seasons for repair, seasons for waiting. During flood months, when many fields disappeared beneath water, laborers often worked on large building projects instead. This helped keep food supplies stable while also providing workers with grain, beer, clothing, and shelter. Even great monuments were connected to the river's balance. The workers who shaped stone blocks beneath the heavy Egyptian sun were not always slaves, as many people later imagined. Many were ordinary laborers fulfilling seasonal duties while the Nile covered farmland. They lived in organized communities. They received food. They rested at night with sore backs and tired hands. Their lives were difficult, but they existed within systems carefully designed to keep society functioning. As sunrise finally spread across the land, the villages beside the Nile fully awakened. Donkeys brayed in narrow streets. Sandals scraped over packed earth. The smell of baking bread drifted through the air. Smoke rose slowly from cooking fires. The heat had not yet reached its full strength. Workers tried to complete difficult labor early whenever possible. By midday, the sun could feel crushing. Farmers moved toward the fields carrying wooden tools over their shoulders. Their linen clothing remained simple and light. The wealthy dressed differently, but most people wore practical garments suited for labor and heat. The roads were dusty already. Even in the morning, fine sand clung to skin and feet. Near irrigation canals, workers checked water flow carefully. Maintaining these canals mattered greatly. If water failed to reach certain fields, crops suffered. If too much water escaped, valuable soil washed away. So villages often cooperated together. Groups of workers repaired canal walls using mud and reeds. Older men gave instructions while younger laborers carried baskets of earth beneath the growing sunlight. The work never truly ended. Something always needed repair. A wall cracked. A roof weakened. A fishing net tore. A storage jar leaked. But these constant small tasks helped hold Egyptian society together. Life depended less on sudden heroic moments and more on endless quiet maintenance. A stable world required constant care. By mid-morning, the sounds of workshops filled larger towns along the Nile. Potters shaped wet clay beneath spinning hands. Carpenters cut wood carefully with bronze tools. Weavers worked linen thread into cloth while flies drifted lazily through the warm air nearby. The smell inside these workshops was thick and earthy. Wet clay, sweat, wood dust, oil lamps, smoke. Workers often labored shoulder to shoulder for long hours. Some sang softly while they worked. Others remained quiet with concentration and fatigue. Scribes occupied a different world, though even their lives followed strict routines. Inside administrative buildings or temple complexes, scribes sat cross-legged with brushes and papyrus sheets nearby. Their fingers darkened with ink as they recorded taxes, grain shipments, labor assignments, and legal matters. Writing held enormous power in Egypt. Most people could not read. But scribes could organize society through careful records. They tracked food supplies. They counted workers. They managed storehouses filled with grain harvested from fertile land. Without records, balance became harder to maintain. And so scribes worked steadily through long days, often inside shaded rooms where the heat felt slightly more bearable. Still, even they grew tired. The Egyptian day became heavy by noon. Heat pressed downward across fields and streets alike. Stone walls radiated warmth. Animals searched for shade. Workers wiped sweat from their faces using rough cloth or bare arms already covered in dust. Some labor slowed during the hottest hours. Others had no choice but to continue. Stone workers near construction sites struck rock beneath blazing sunlight. The sound echoed rhythmically through the dry air. Men hauled materials using ropes that burned against their hands. Water carriers became important during these hours. Large clay jars moved constantly between wells, canals, workshops, and homes. Cool water provided relief, even if only briefly. Beer also formed a major part of Egyptian daily life. It was thick, nutritious, and safer than stagnant water in many places. Workers often received beer as payment alongside bread and onions. Families brewed it regularly at home. The taste differed greatly from modern beer. It was heavier, cloudier, closer to liquid bread. But it helped sustain people through exhausting labor and heat. As afternoon slowly arrived, the pace of the land softened slightly. Children played in narrow shaded spaces beside homes. Elderly villagers sat quietly near walls where small breezes occasionally passed through. Women repaired clothing or prepared evening meals while speaking softly with neighbors. Life beside the Nile depended heavily on community. People rarely lived entirely alone. Families shared sleeping spaces. Neighbors borrowed tools. Workers depended upon one another during harvests and construction. Even grief and illness were often carried together by groups rather than individuals. When someone became too weak to work, others sometimes stepped forward quietly to help maintain balance within the village. Not always. Life could still be harsh. Food shortages happened. Disease spread. Injuries ended livelihoods. But survival beside the Nile often required cooperation more than isolation. And over many centuries, this shared understanding helped Egyptian society remain remarkably stable. The temples also played a major role in maintaining order. These were not only places of worship. They were economic centers, storage centers, and places of employment. Temple lands produced crops. Temple workers prepared offerings. Priests oversaw rituals believed necessary for keeping harmony between humanity and the divine world. The gods themselves were deeply connected to natural balance. The flooding river. The movement of the sun. The changing sky. The growth of crops. Everything seemed connected through invisible threads. For ordinary Egyptians, daily religious life often felt gentle and personal rather than dramatic. Small household shrines stood inside homes. Families whispered prayers quietly for health, protection, or successful harvests. People hoped for stability. Enough grain. Healthy children. Protection from illness. Relief from heat. Safe flooding seasons. Simple hopes carried through ordinary days. And slowly the sun drifted lower across the western sky. The worst heat finally began to loosen its grip. Long shadows stretched across roads and fields. Workers returned home with slower steps now. Their clothing carried dust and sweat from the long day. The evening meal became one of the quiet centers of Egyptian family life. Bread again. Beer again. Sometimes fish from the river. Sometimes onions, lentils, figs, or dates. Wealthier households ate better, of course. Meat remained rare for many ordinary workers. But after long labor beneath the sun, even simple food brought comfort. Families gathered close together as darkness slowly returned. Oil lamps flickered against mud walls. Children grew sleepy. The sounds of villages softened gradually into night once more. And above everything flowed the Nile. Always moving. Always patient. Its steady presence helped shape the emotional rhythm of Egyptian civilization itself. The river gave people confidence that tomorrow would likely resemble today. Crops would grow again. Boats would travel again. Bread would bake again before sunrise. This predictability mattered deeply. Many ancient societies faced constant collapse through invasion, drought, or unstable food supplies. Egypt faced dangers too, certainly. But the Nile created a strong foundation for continuity across generations. Children often inherited the professions of their parents. Farmers raised future farmers. Craftsmen trained sons and daughters in familiar skills. Fishing families remained tied to river life. This continuity strengthened social stability. Life changed slowly. Very slowly. A man might wake each morning beside the same river his grandfather once fished decades earlier. He might plant crops in fields prepared by ancestors long gone. He might walk roads worn smooth by countless generations before him. And because life moved with such steady rhythm, Egyptian society developed deep habits of patience and endurance. At night, the stars above the desert appeared brilliantly clear. Without modern lights, the heavens stretched endlessly across the darkness. Egyptians studied these stars carefully. Priests tracked celestial movements. Farmers watched seasonal changes in the night sky. The stars themselves became part of the larger balance. Some workers slept indoors on woven mats. Others rested upon rooftops where cooler air moved gently after sunset. The body aches of labor remained constant companions. Feet hardened from walking. Hands roughened by tools and rope. Shoulders sore from carrying water or stone. Yet exhaustion also carried its own quiet comfort at day's end. The work was finished for now. Tomorrow would come soon enough. And so the land settled again into silence. Far beyond the villages, the desert stretched outward beneath moonlight. Dry hills watched over the fertile ribbon of green surrounding the Nile. Tombs rested quietly in western sands where Egyptians buried their dead with careful rituals meant to preserve order even beyond life itself. Death, too, belonged to balance. The Egyptians believed existence continued after the body failed. Great preparation surrounded burial practices because maintaining harmony between worlds mattered greatly. But even here, ordinary people experienced death differently from kings. Most villagers received simple burials. Simple offerings. Simple tombs. Yet the emotional desires remained similar. To rest peacefully. To remain remembered. To stay connected to family and land. In many ways, Egyptian society balanced itself by giving people strong feelings of continuity. Life connected naturally to the past, the present, and the hope for future. The river returned each year. Families endured. Work continued. The gods watched. And while rulers changed over centuries, daily life for ordinary people often remained surprisingly familiar. This familiarity created emotional stability. People understood their roles. They understood seasonal rhythms. They understood the expectations surrounding work, religion, family, and community. That understanding reduced chaos. Even during difficult periods, many routines continued quietly forward beneath larger political changes. As midnight deepened across the Nile Valley, the world became softer again. Temple fires glowed faintly in distant darkness. Palm leaves rustled quietly. River insects drifted above black water. A fisherman sleeping beside his boat turned slowly beneath a linen cloth. A tired mother rested near cooling bread ovens. A scribe rubbed aching fingers before sleep finally reached him. And somewhere in the darkness, the Nile continued flowing steadily northward through the silent ancient land. Long before the first pale light touched the eastern horizon again, the riverbanks already carried quiet movement. In the darkness, fishermen stood knee-deep in shallow water beside narrow boats tied with worn rope. The mud beneath their feet felt cool after the long heat of the previous day. Reeds swayed gently beside them, brushing against bare legs as they prepared nets by touch more than sight. The Nile at night could feel almost endless. The surface reflected scattered stars in soft broken shapes. Small ripples moved outward from drifting boats. Somewhere far across the water, another fisherman called softly into the darkness, his voice carrying slowly over the calm river air. Most people in ancient Egypt slept lightly. The world around them never became fully silent. Animals moved during the night. Wind pressed sand against walls. Babies cried. Workers coughed in their sleep after breathing dust all day beneath the sun. Inside many homes, entire families rested together in a single room. Privacy existed differently then. Space was limited. The homes of ordinary workers were practical places built for survival more than comfort. Mud brick walls held warmth from the daytime heat long into the night. In cooler months, this warmth helped people sleep comfortably. But during the hottest parts of the year, the air indoors became thick and difficult. Families often climbed ladders to flat rooftops where breezes moved more freely beneath the stars. There they slept side by side on woven mats. Children curled close beside parents. Grandparents rested nearby beneath thin linen coverings. And above them stretched one of the clearest night skies in the ancient world. Egyptian life depended heavily upon these quiet hours of rest because the coming day demanded so much from the human body. Nearly every task required physical effort. Grain had to be carried. Water had to be lifted. Fields had to be worked by hand beneath relentless heat. Even simple survival slowly exhausted the muscles. As the night slowly faded, the first sounds of waking life returned once more. A cough. The scrape of sandals against stone. The crackling of rekindled cooking fires. The soft rhythmic sound of grinding grain. This sound greeted the dawn across Egypt almost every single day for thousands of years. Women bent forward over grinding stones while the sky slowly brightened outside. Their shoulders and arms performed the same motions again and again until flour collected beneath rough fingers dusted white. The work damaged the body over time. Archaeologists many centuries later would discover worn joints and strained bones in the remains of ordinary Egyptian workers. Repetition shaped their lives. The body remembered every movement. Still, the grinding continued. Bread remained too important. In wealthier homes, servants often performed these tasks. But for most people, every family member contributed labor according to age and strength. Children learned work early. A young boy might begin carrying water jars while still very small. A girl might help shape dough or clean fish beside her mother long before adulthood. Life beside the Nile rarely allowed long periods of idleness. But there was also rhythm inside the labor. Predictable rhythm. Comforting rhythm. The same tasks returned with each sunrise, and because of that, people understood where they belonged within the world around them. Outside the villages, the eastern sky slowly changed color. Soft gray became pale blue. Then faint gold appeared across the horizon. Palm trees emerged from darkness one shape at a time. Birds began calling from reeds along irrigation canals. The desert beyond the fertile land remained quiet and still, its wide emptiness waiting beneath the coming heat. Then finally the sun rose. Almost immediately, warmth spread across the Nile Valley once again. Farmers moved toward the fields early, hoping to complete difficult work before midday temperatures became overwhelming. They carried simple wooden plows, baskets, ropes, and stone tools worn smooth by long use. Oxen moved slowly beside them. The animals breathed heavily even in early morning warmth. Dust rose around their hooves as they crossed narrow paths between canals and fields. The farming year in Egypt followed the river closely. When floodwaters arrived, much farmland disappeared beneath rich brown water. The floods looked destructive at first glance, yet they carried the fertile soil that made Egyptian civilization possible. After the waters withdrew, farmers planted quickly. Seeds pressed into wet earth beneath bare feet. Hands worked carefully across dark soil still moist from the flood. Then came months of watching and waiting. Water management mattered constantly. Canals directed river water toward crops. Workers inspected barriers and channels every day because small failures could become serious problems very quickly. An irrigation wall collapsing at the wrong moment might destroy valuable fields. So maintenance became part of ordinary life. Always repairing. Always checking. Always preparing for the next season. This constant attention helped Egyptian society remain balanced for so long. Stability did not appear magically. It required endless small acts of care performed quietly by ordinary people. As the morning continued, river traffic increased steadily. Boats drifted north and south carrying grain, pottery, fish, papyrus reeds, stone, wood, and passengers moving between settlements. The Nile functioned almost like a great road connecting the entire land. Travel by river was often easier than travel across dry desert ground. Boatmen understood the winds and currents well. Southbound boats used sails when northern winds blew steadily. Northbound travel often relied upon the river current itself. The movement of boats created a calm, steady rhythm upon the water. Wood creaked softly. Oars dipped gently. Voices drifted across the river air. Merchants sat beneath simple shade coverings while cargo rested nearby in baskets or clay jars. Some traveled only short distances between villages. Others journeyed much farther, bringing goods from distant regions. Trade strengthened Egyptian stability too. Communities exchanged what they lacked. Fish from the river. Stone from quarries. Linen cloth from skilled workshops. Papyrus for writing. Grain from fertile farmland. Even in ancient times, balance depended partly upon movement and exchange between people. Near larger towns, markets slowly filled with activity beneath the growing heat. The smells became stronger here. Fresh bread. Dry fish. Sweat. Livestock. Mud. Smoke from cooking fires. Voices blended together in steady conversation rather than loud chaos. People bargained carefully over food, tools, cloth, oil, and household goods. Children followed parents through crowded pathways while stray dogs wandered beneath tables searching for scraps. The marketplace reflected daily Egyptian life more honestly than palaces ever could. Most people cared less about royal ceremonies than about grain prices, healthy crops, and whether enough fish could be caught before evening. Survival lived close to the body. Close to hunger. Close to fatigue. And so ordinary routines mattered greatly. Nearby, scribes sat beneath shaded areas recording transactions and deliveries. Their work supported the entire administrative structure that helped Egypt remain organized. Records mattered constantly. How much grain entered storage? How many workers completed labor duties? How much tax was collected from each region? Without accurate records, shortages and confusion could spread quickly. The scribes themselves occupied an unusual place within society. Their labor was mental rather than physical, yet their days could still feel exhausting. They spent long hours seated cross-legged with brushes and ink, carefully forming symbols across papyrus sheets. Many young boys trained for years to become scribes. The education was strict. Mistakes were corrected repeatedly. Students copied texts over and over until writing became smooth and precise. For some families, having a son become a scribe meant relief from the hardest physical labor of field work or construction. Yet scribes still lived disciplined lives tied closely to order and routine. And routine itself became one of the quiet foundations of Egyptian civilization. As midday approached, the sun climbed higher into a pale white sky. Heat spread heavily across the land. Shadows shortened. The air itself seemed slower now. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads or shoulders for protection. Water jars emptied quickly. Sweat darkened linen clothing. The stone walls of temples and workshops radiated trapped warmth outward into narrow streets. During these hours, fatigue settled deeply into the body. A farmer straightened slowly from his work, pressing aching hands against his lower back. A potter paused beside spinning clay, wiping sweat from tired eyes. A fisherman repaired torn nets beneath weak shade while flies gathered nearby. The human body worked constantly in ancient Egypt. There were few machines. Few comforts. Most labor depended entirely upon muscle, endurance, patience, and repetition. And yet, despite the hardship, many people still found moments of peace inside ordinary routines. A cool drink of water after hours in the field. A brief breeze from the river. The sound of children laughing nearby. Fresh bread shared at day's end. Small comforts mattered greatly in a difficult world. Inside homes during the hottest hours, daily household work continued slowly. Women prepared vegetables, brewed beer, washed clothing, cleaned floors, and cared for children or elderly family members. The work inside the home was never truly finished either. Dust entered constantly. Food spoiled quickly in heat. Water had to be carried again and again. Yet households formed the center of Egyptian social stability. Families taught behavior, religion, practical skills, and social duties through everyday life. Respect for parents and elders remained important. Cooperation within the household helped everyone survive difficult seasons. In many homes, small household shrines stood quietly against walls. Tiny offerings rested there. Flowers, bread, oil. Simple prayers whispered during uncertain times. Religion in Egypt often blended gently into daily routine rather than existing separately from it. The divine world felt close beside ordinary life. The rising sun. The flooding river. The growth of crops. The birth of children. The movement of stars overhead. Everything seemed connected through larger patterns beyond human control. This belief helped many Egyptians accept hardship with patience. Difficult labor became part of maintaining order within the world itself. And so people continued. One day after another. One season after another. By late afternoon, the worst heat finally began to soften. Long shadows stretched slowly across courtyards and roads. Animals became more active again. Workers started returning from fields, workshops, docks, and construction sites. The pace of the land changed gently now. Evening approached. This was often the quietest and most comforting part of the day. Families gathered near doorways where cooler air slowly moved through the villages. Cooking fires glowed softly as meals were prepared. The smell of baking bread drifted once more into narrow streets. Children played beside walls still warm from sunlight. Old men sat together speaking quietly about crops, river levels, taxes, or memories from earlier years. Nearby, women carried water jars balanced carefully while the last golden light touched the tops of palm trees beside the Nile. The river itself looked different in evening light. Softer. Darker. Almost bronze beneath the setting sun. Boats returned slowly toward shore. Fishermen sorted their catches while birds circled low above the water searching for scraps. Some workers bathed in the river before returning home. Dust washed away from tired skin. Cool water soothed aching muscles after long labor beneath the sun. Then darkness slowly returned once more. Oil lamps flickered alive inside homes across the Nile Valley. Their small flames reflected against pottery jars and mud walls. Families ate simple meals together while the sounds of the day gradually faded. Bread torn by hand. Fish roasted over coals. Beer poured carefully into cups. Quiet conversation. Tired silence. For many ordinary Egyptians, these evening hours held the deepest sense of balance. The labor was finished. The family remained together. Food had been prepared successfully for another day. Tomorrow's worries could wait until sunrise. Outside, stars appeared again one by one above the darkening desert. The same stars watched over generations of Egyptian families across centuries that seemed endless at the time. Parents raised children beneath those skies. Workers slept after exhausting labor beneath those skies. Priests studied celestial movements beneath those skies. And through it all, Egyptian society continued moving forward with remarkable steadiness. Not because life was easy, but because millions of ordinary routines connected together like threads in woven linen. A farmer planting grain. A scribe recording harvest totals. A potter shaping jars for storing food. A mother grinding flour before dawn. A fisherman casting nets beneath moonlight. Each small act supported the others. Each person depended upon larger systems of cooperation, tradition, and shared rhythm. Even the architecture reflected this quiet stability. Homes were built close together using familiar materials gathered from the land itself. Mud brick cooled surprisingly well compared to stone during certain seasons. Roofs became sleeping spaces at night. Courtyards allowed air movement during hotter hours. Nothing was wasted easily. Broken pottery sometimes became tools or building filler. Old cloth found new purposes. Leftover grain was stored carefully against uncertain seasons ahead. Storage itself played an enormous role in maintaining balance. Granaries protected communities from famine during poor harvest years. Officials monitored supplies carefully. Grain functioned almost like the foundation beneath the entire society. Without stored grain, order weakened quickly. Hunger created fear. Fear created unrest. And so Egyptian administrators focused heavily on managing food supplies across the kingdom. This attention to practical needs helped the civilization endure through many generations. Still, ordinary life remained physically demanding almost all the time. Feet toughened from walking long distances barefoot or in simple sandals. Hands cracked from labor and dry air. Eyes strained beneath bright sunlight reflecting from pale stone and water. Many workers likely lived with constant pain that simply became normal over time. Yet life continued quietly around these hardships. At night, exhausted bodies rested. Dreams came slowly. The Nile flowed onward through darkness. And somewhere in the distance, From a temple hidden beyond palm trees and sleeping villages, the faint sound of chanting drifted softly into the warm Egyptian night. The chanting from the distant temple faded slowly into the night wind, becoming softer and softer until only the quiet movement of the Nile remained. Far across the dark fields, water insects hovered above irrigation canals. Frogs called from muddy banks hidden among reeds. The air smelled faintly of river mud, damp plants, smoke from dying cooking fires, and the dry dust that covered nearly everything in Egypt. Most villages now rested completely. Only a few lamps still glowed behind small windows or open doorways. Inside one narrow mud brick home, an elderly woman sat awake beside a sleeping child. Her hands moved slowly as she repaired torn linen beneath the weak orange light of an oil lamp. The room around her was simple. Clay jars rested against the wall. Baskets hung from wooden pegs. A grinding stone sat near the doorway where morning work would begin again before sunrise. The old woman's fingers worked carefully despite long years of labor that had stiffened her joints. Outside, sandals brushed softly against the road as a late traveler passed through the sleeping village. Then silence returned once more. Ancient Egypt often appears still in surviving carvings and statues. The figures stand upright and calm, frozen forever in stone. But real life beside the Nile was full of movement. Quiet movement. Endless movement. Water carried by hand. Boats drifting with current and wind. Workers bending, lifting, walking, building. Children growing. Fields changing color with the seasons. The civilization stayed balanced partly because people accepted this constant motion as natural. No day remained exactly the same. Yet every day still followed familiar rhythms. Even illness followed rhythms people understood. The human body struggled constantly against heat, insects, infection, exhaustion, and poor nutrition during difficult years. A simple wound could become dangerous. Fever spread quickly through crowded households. River water carried sickness along with life itself. And still, ordinary people woke each morning and continued working. In many villages, healers practiced simple forms of medicine using herbs, oils, bandages, honey, and prayers. Egyptian medical knowledge was surprisingly organized for its time. Some healers specialized in certain illnesses or injuries. Temple complexes sometimes stored medical texts copied carefully by scribes. But for most ordinary families, sickness remained deeply personal and uncertain. A mother cooled a fevered child with damp cloths beside the river breeze. An exhausted laborer rested aching limbs after weeks beneath the sun. An old fisherman coughed quietly through the night while family members slept nearby. Illness became part of life's balance too. Not welcomed, but accepted. The Egyptians believed disorder could enter the world in many forms. Floods could fail. Crops could weaken. Disease could spread. So maintaining harmony mattered not only politically or spiritually, but physically as well. A healthy body reflected balance. A healthy household reflected balance. A healthy kingdom reflected balance. As the deepest hours of night slowly passed, the stars wheeled silently overhead. Priests in certain temples remained awake during these hours, tending sacred fires and observing rituals that connected earthly life to divine order. The temples themselves stood enormous and cool compared to ordinary homes. Stone columns rose into darkness. Incense drifted through shadowed halls. Torchlight flickered softly against carved walls. Temple workers cleaned floors, carried offerings, prepared oils, washed sacred objects, and maintained strict routines repeated day after day without interruption. The temples functioned almost like carefully breathing hearts within Egyptian society. Not loud. Not chaotic. Steady. Reliable. Their storehouses held grain. Their workshops produced goods. Their lands employed farmers and laborers. Religion and daily economics lived side by side beneath temple roofs. And because rituals continued so consistently, many Egyptians felt reassured that the world itself remained stable. Far from the temples, however, ordinary laborers experienced the sacred world in quieter ways. A whispered prayer before planting seeds. A small offering left beside a household shrine. A protective amulet worn beneath linen clothing. A moment of silence beside the Nile at sunset. Religion moved gently through ordinary life rather than standing apart from it. Then slowly, almost invisibly, the eastern horizon began changing once again. Night loosened its hold over the Nile Valley. Cool air drifted low across the fields before sunrise. This was one of the few truly comfortable moments of the Egyptian day, especially during hotter seasons. Workers who rose early often cherished these brief hours before the full strength of sunlight returned. A fisherman sleeping beside his boat opened his eyes slowly. Nearby, another man stirred awake on a rooftop beneath fading stars. His back ached from yesterday's labor. Dust clung to his feet and arms. For a few moments he simply listened to the soft river sounds around him before beginning another day. Then the grinding stones began again. Across villages large and small, women prepared grain while darkness slowly turned gray. The sound spread through narrow streets like quiet music repeated endlessly across centuries. Stone against stone. Grain becoming flour. The smell of fresh dough slowly mixing with cool morning air. Children woke reluctantly beside warm walls. Some carried water jars immediately after rising. Others helped sweep floors or gather fuel for cooking fires. Even very young children understood responsibility early in life. The survival of the household depended upon everyone contributing something. Yet childhood still existed beside the labor. Children laughed while chasing one another through dusty courtyards. They played simple games with carved pieces of wood or stones. They swam in shallow river water during hotter afternoons when work allowed moments of rest. Parents watched them carefully. The Nile gave life, but it also carried danger. Strong currents, deep water, crocodiles farther south, sickness from stagnant pools after floods. Egyptians respected the river because they understood both its generosity and its power. As dawn spread fully across the land, the world brightened into shades of gold and pale brown. Palm trees cast long shadows. Birds circled above fields. Donkeys moved slowly along roads carrying baskets, tools, or jars balanced carefully across their backs. Smoke rose from cooking fires in thin gray lines toward the morning sky. This was the hour when Egypt truly awakened. Farmers headed toward the fields once more. The flood season determined much of their yearly work, but daily farming routines still required constant effort. Workers loosened soil with simple tools. Others carried water using wooden poles balanced across their shoulders. Some repaired damaged irrigation walls weakened by moisture and time. The labor rarely felt dramatic. It was repetitive, measured, patient. But these small repeated tasks fed entire communities. Egyptian society remained balanced partly because farming itself demanded cooperation. Irrigation systems connected villages together. Water had to be shared carefully. Timing mattered. Maintenance mattered. One neglected canal could affect many families. So people learned the value of coordination early. Village leaders, local officials, and experienced farmers often work together to organize labor schedules around planting and harvest seasons. This cooperation strengthened stability across generations. The work itself could feel almost hypnotic. A farmer pressing seeds into dark soil beneath the warming sun. A steady rhythm of movement and breath. Birdsong nearby. Water flowing gently through irrigation channels. Dust rising around tired feet. Hours passing slowly beneath the white Egyptian sky. By mid-morning, workshops again filled with life and sound. Potters shaped jars needed for storing grain, oil, beer, and water. The demand for containers never ended in ancient Egypt. Every household depended upon pottery for daily survival. The potter's hands moved steadily over spinning clay. Wet earth cooled his fingers briefly before the growing heat returned again. Nearby, linen weavers worked with quiet concentration inside crowded rooms where thread stretched carefully across wooden frames. Linen production required enormous labor from beginning to end. Flax plants had to be harvested. Fibers separated. Threads spun. Cloth woven slowly by hand. The finished linen clothed workers, wrapped the dead, covered beds, filtered beer, protected food, and served countless daily needs. Nothing in Egyptian life existed separately from labor. Even comfort required effort first. Inside another workshop, carpenters shaped wood imported from distant lands because large trees remained rare in much of Egypt. Wood was valuable. Skilled craftsmen used it carefully for furniture, boats, tools, doors, and religious objects. The smell of cut wood mixed with sweat and dust beneath the heavy air. Hammering echoed softly through open doorways. Outside, the streets grew warmer. Merchants arranged goods beneath shaded coverings while flies drifted lazily around baskets of dates, onions, and dried fish. Scribes nearby recorded deliveries with patient precision, their reed brushes moving across papyrus in careful dark strokes. The scribes themselves often came from families hoping for greater security and social advancement. Education offered opportunities unavailable to many field laborers. Yet the training demanded discipline. Young students copied symbols repeatedly until wrists became sore and cramped. Teachers corrected mistakes strictly because accurate records protected the functioning of society itself. A missing number in grain storage records could create serious problems later. Too little food stored before poor harvests might lead to hunger. Too much taxation might burden farming communities unfairly. Administration helped maintain balance between regions, workers, and resources. And so the quiet work of writing mattered deeply. As the sun climbed higher, the heat returned with full strength once more. The light itself seemed almost white now. Stone walls radiated warmth. Air shimmered above roads and rooftops. Workers paused more frequently to drink water or beer from clay jars kept in shaded areas whenever possible. Some laborers wrapped damp cloth around their necks for relief. Others simply endured. Heat exhaustion was common. The body slowed naturally beneath such conditions. Movements became heavier. Conversations shorter. Even animals sought shade wherever they could find it. Inside homes, women prepared the midday meal while younger children rested or slept during the hottest hours. Older family members sometimes sat quietly near doorways where small currents of air moved through shaded spaces. These quieter afternoon moments formed another important part of Egyptian balance. Life did not rush constantly forward. There were pauses. Moments of stillness. Time for cooling bodies and slower breathing before evening work resumed. In wealthier homes, servants handled many difficult tasks. But most Egyptians lived much more modestly. Furniture remained limited. Floors were simple. Rooms stayed crowded. Daily chores consumed large portions of life. Yet homes also carried warmth and familiarity. The smell of bread baking. Children sleeping beside woven baskets. Light flickering against mud brick walls. The sound of family voices at day's end. These ordinary details grounded people emotionally within their communities. As afternoon slowly softened toward evening again, river life became busier. Boats returned loaded with fish or trade goods. Farmers washed tools beside canals. Children gathered reeds near the water's edge while parents called warnings from nearby paths. The Nile reflected the lowering sun in long bands of bronze and gold. Birds moved across the sky in dark graceful shapes. A cooler breeze finally drifted through the villages after the long heat. Relief spread slowly through tired bodies. Evening meals began once more. Families gathered beneath fading light while smoke curled upward from cooking fires. Workers stretched aching limbs beside doorways. Some spoke quietly with neighbors about river levels, taxes, harvest expectations, or rumors from distant towns. Most conversations remained practical. Daily survival required practical thinking. Yet people also told stories. Ancient stories carried through generations beside the Nile. Stories of gods traveling through the night sky. Stories of wise rulers. Stories of floods, journeys, love, loss, and endurance. Children listened sleepily while darkness slowly covered the land again. Then one by one, lamps appeared across the villages. Small glowing points against the deepening night. The labor of another day had ended. And once more, ancient Egypt settled softly into darkness beneath the endless stars. The darkness along the Nile deepened slowly, like ink spreading across still water. The last voices faded from the village paths. Cooking fires settled into dim orange coals. Somewhere near the riverbank, a tethered donkey shifted its weight and gave a tired breath through its nose before becoming quiet again. Most people were asleep now. The workers who spent the day carrying stone or digging canals rested heavily on woven mats. Farmers slept with sore shoulders and cracked hands folded loosely against their chests. Children curled close beside parents beneath thin linen coverings while warm night air drifted softly through open doorways. The village itself seemed to breathe slowly in the darkness. Ancient Egypt often looked peaceful from a distance. The river flowed calmly. Palm trees swayed gently. Temples rose beautifully beneath the sun. But maintaining that peaceful appearance required endless effort from countless ordinary people whose names would never be remembered. The balance of Egyptian society rested upon tired bodies. It rested upon routine. Upon repetition. Upon the willingness of millions of people across centuries to wake each morning and continue their work. Far from the villages, beyond the fertile ribbon beside the Nile, the desert remained vast and silent beneath moonlight. The Egyptians understood the desert well. It surrounded their world on both sides like an endless sea of stone and sand. Travelers crossing it moved carefully between wells and trade routes. Quarry workers cut stone from desert cliffs beneath terrible heat. Soldiers marched through dry valleys where little grew. But most ordinary villagers rarely wandered far from the river. The Nile gave them nearly everything they needed. Water, food, transportation, fertile land, fish, birds, reeds for baskets and boats, mud for bricks. Life gathered close to the river because beyond it stretched difficulty and emptiness. And this closeness helped create social stability. Communities remained connected tightly together. Villages depended upon one another. News traveled steadily along the riverbanks through merchants, officials, priests, and boatmen moving between settlements. Even distant regions of Egypt shared similar rhythms because the Nile connected them all. As midnight slowly passed, the night air cooled further. A fisherman sleeping beside his boat woke briefly to pull a linen cloth over his shoulders. Nearby, water lapped softly against wooden hulls tied along the muddy bank. The smell of wet reeds mixed with cool river air. Fishing communities lived by rhythms slightly different from farming villages. Many fishermen worked during early morning or nighttime hours when conditions were calmer and cooler. Their lives remained deeply tied to the moods of the river itself. They understood currents, water depth, seasonal fish movement, hidden dangers beneath dark water. Small fishing boats drifted quietly beneath moonlight while nets spread outward in smooth circles. Oars moved carefully to avoid unnecessary noise. Fishing required patience more than speed. And patience became one of the most important qualities throughout Egyptian life. The river did not hurry. The flood seasons arrived gradually. Crops grew slowly beneath the sun. Stone monuments took decades to complete. Even social change often unfolded across generations rather than sudden moments. This slower pace shaped the emotional character of Egyptian civilization. People expected repetition, continuity, order. Near larger towns, guards carrying wooden staffs walked quietly along walls and storehouses during the night hours. Granaries required protection because grain meant survival itself. Stored grain represented stability. Without it, poor flood seasons could become disasters. The state carefully monitored harvests, taxes, and storage supplies throughout the kingdom. Scribes kept detailed records because administration helped prevent hunger and unrest. Much of Egyptian balance depended upon preparation. Preparing for drought. Preparing for flood changes. Preparing for shortages. Preparing for future seasons still unseen. Inside storage buildings, sacks of grain rested in thick dusty silence while rats searched constantly for openings in walls or baskets. Cats moved quietly through these spaces at night, protecting valuable food supplies from pests. Even animals held important places within Egyptian society. Oxen pulled plows. Donkeys carried cargo. Cats guarded grain. Geese and ducks provided food. Dogs guarded homes and hunting parties. Life beside the Nile created close daily contact between humans and animals in ways that felt ordinary and necessary. Before dawn, the stars above the eastern horizon slowly began fading again. Night retreated carefully from the land. And once more the villages stirred awake. The beginning of each day often looked nearly identical to the one before it. This sameness could feel exhausting. But it also created emotional security. People understood what morning required from them. They knew where to go. What tasks waited. What routines shaped the hours ahead. For ordinary workers, uncertainty usually came not from daily schedules but from disruptions to them. Failed floods. Disease. Political instability. Poor harvests. These threatened balance because they interrupted familiar rhythms. As gray light spread across the Nile Valley, women once again knelt beside grinding stones. The movement had become almost automatic after years of repetition. Hands pushed grain steadily while backs bent forward in practiced positions learned since childhood. The sound returned across Egypt like a heartbeat. Grinding stone against grain. Steady. Endless. Nearby, clay ovens warmed slowly while dough rested beneath cloth coverings. Bread preparation required constant attention. Different households baked different kinds depending upon wealth and available ingredients, but bread remained central to nearly every meal. The smell of fresh baking drifted into cool morning air. Children carried water jars from wells or canals before sunrise temperatures increased. Some laughed quietly together while walking narrow paths between homes. Others remained sleepy and silent, still rubbing dust from their eyes. Early morning was often the gentlest part of the Egyptian day. Birdsong filled palm trees beside the river. Dew clung briefly to reeds before sunlight burned it away. Farmers moved toward the fields while shadows still stretched long across the earth. For a short time, the world felt calm and cool. Then the heat slowly returned again. In farming villages, seasonal labor determined much of life's structure. During planting seasons, activity intensified everywhere. Entire communities worked together preparing fields after flood waters receded. Seeds had to be planted quickly while soil still held moisture from the Nile. Workers moved barefoot through thick dark mud carrying baskets of grain. Oxen pulled wooden plows slowly through wet earth. Voices called softly across the fields while birds followed behind searching for insects and scattered seeds. Planting season carried hope with it. Good harvests meant stability. Enough food. Enough grain taxes. Enough stored supplies for difficult times ahead. Poor harvests brought worry long before hunger actually arrived. The Egyptians watched the Nile carefully because its flooding patterns shaped nearly everything. Too little flooding reduced fertile soil and water supplies. Too much flooding damaged settlements and fields. Balance mattered constantly. And because life depended so heavily upon natural rhythms, the Egyptians developed deep respect for predictability and order. This respect extended into government itself. Pharaohs were expected to maintain harmony across the kingdom. Their role was not only political but spiritual. If chaos spread through the land, many believed it reflected imbalance between humanity, nature, and the divine world. But while rulers occupied the top of society, ordinary administrators performed much of the practical work required to keep Egypt functioning smoothly. Tax collectors traveled between villages recording harvests. Local officials settled disputes over land or irrigation. Scribes tracked labor assignments and food supplies. Messengers carried information along the Nile between regions. Much of this work happened quietly. Without ceremony. Without great monuments. Yet these systems helped Egyptian society endure across centuries. Inside one crowded workshop near a riverside town, a group of laborers shaped mud bricks beneath the growing morning heat. The process was simple but exhausting. Mud from the Nile mixed with straw and water beneath bare feet until thick and heavy. Workers pressed the mixture into wooden molds, then left the bricks to dry beneath the sun. Mud brick built most ordinary Egyptian homes. Temples and tombs used stone, but everyday life rested inside structures made from earth itself. The walls cracked over time. Rain damaged them during rare storms. Heat slowly wore them down. So repairs never truly stopped. Every village constantly rebuilt small pieces of itself year after year. Nearby, children helped stack drying bricks in neat rows while adults continued mixing fresh mud. The smell of wet earth filled the warm air around them. Dust clung to sweating skin almost immediately. By mid-morning, the roads beside the Nile grew busy again. Merchants traveled with donkeys carrying baskets filled with onions, dates, pottery, cloth, or fish packed in salt. Boatmen unloaded goods near docks while scribes recorded shipments nearby. Trade routes extended beyond Egypt as well. Wood arrived from distant forests. Copper from mines. Luxury goods from foreign lands. Though ordinary villagers rarely traveled far themselves, Egypt remained connected to wider regions through commerce and diplomacy. Still, most people's lives stayed centered close to home. Close to family. Close to familiar fields and waterways. A farmer might live his entire life within a relatively small stretch of the Nile Valley. Yet within that small world existed everything necessary for meaning and survival. Work, family, religion, community, the passing of seasons, the movement of the stars. As the sun climbed higher once again, workers slowed beneath the heat. The brightness became intense now. White stone reflected sunlight painfully. Air shimmered above rooftops. Sweat darkened linen clothing across backs and shoulders. Some workers paused beneath narrow shaded spaces beside walls or trees. Water jars passed carefully from hand to hand. Even brief moments of rest mattered during long Egyptian afternoons. Inside homes, women prepared food while infants slept nearby in the heavy warmth. Older children sometimes fanned cooking fires or helped repair baskets and clothing. Domestic labor remained constant and physically demanding too. Sweeping, grinding, brewing, cooking, cleaning, washing linen, carrying water, caring for the sick and elderly. The balance of Egyptian society depended just as much upon these quiet household tasks as upon farming or administration. Perhaps even more. Because every worker eventually returned home exhausted at day's end. And the home restored enough strength for tomorrow's labor to begin again. Outside, the Nile flowed onward beneath the afternoon sun. Slow. Brown. Endless. A boat drifted quietly downstream carrying sacks of grain toward distant storehouses while reeds bent softly beside the riverbank in the warm wind. The boat moved slowly with the current, hardly making a sound against the broad brown water. Its wooden hull creaked gently beneath the weight of grain sacks stacked in careful rows. A thin cloth canopy provided small patches of shade for the boatmen guiding the vessel northward along the Nile. Their skin had darkened from years beneath the sun. Their hands were rough from rope, oars, and wet wood. One of the men dipped his fingers briefly into the river beside the boat. The water felt warm already. Morning had passed fully now, and the long Egyptian afternoon stretched ahead beneath a pale sky filled with heat. Along the riverbanks, farmers continued working through the difficult hours as best they could. Some cut reeds near shallow water. Others repaired small canals damaged by erosion or wandering animals during the night. Oxen stood nearly motionless in the sunlight, their tails flicking lazily against flies. The air smelled of wet mud, crushed plants, and dry dust carried by slow desert winds. Everything in Egypt seemed touched by dust. It gathered upon shelves inside homes. It settled into woven cloth. It coated roads, tools, baskets, and skin. Even after washing in the river, fine sand returned quickly beneath sandals and fingernails. The people accepted this as naturally as they accepted the heat. Dust belonged to the land. And the land shaped everyone living upon it. Near one riverside village, a group of boys carried bundles of papyrus reeds toward a workshop shaded beneath palm trees. Their bare feet moved carefully across the warm earth while insects buzzed softly nearby. Papyrus was valuable throughout Egypt. The reeds growing beside the Nile became rope, baskets, sandals, mats, boats, and most famously, writing material for scribes. Workers sliced the plant into thin strips and pressed them together into sheets that dried beneath weighted boards. The process required patience. Like nearly everything else, nothing in Egypt happened quickly without cost. Even large construction projects moved according to careful rhythms. Stone had to be quarried, transported, shaped, lifted, and positioned by enormous groups of laborers working together in organized systems. And still, much of Egyptian balance came not from grand projects, but from ordinary daily cooperation between people whose names disappeared into time. A woman sharing grain with a neighbor after a poor harvest. A fisherman helping repair another man's damaged net. Workers rebuilding a collapsed canal wall together before flood season arrived. Small acts of cooperation strengthened entire communities. Without them, village life would have become much harder. By midday, the heat settled heavily over the Nile Valley. The sunlight felt almost solid now. Roads emptied slightly during the hottest hours as people sought shade wherever possible. Palm groves offered relief beside canals. Thick mud brick walls cooled interiors better than open streets. Workshops became quieter as exhausted laborers slowed their pace. Inside one weaving room, several women worked silently beside hanging linen threads while warm air drifted through narrow openings high in the wall. Sweat shined across their foreheads. Their fingers moved steadily despite fatigue, guiding thread back and forth across wooden looms. The repetitive motion could continue for hours. Back. Forth. Back. Forth. The sound of weaving blended softly with distant street noise and the occasional cry of river birds outside. Many Egyptian workers spent their lives performing the same movements day after day. Bodies adapted to these routines over time. Hands hardened. Muscles strengthened. But the labor also wore people down slowly. Arthritis, injuries, damaged backs, aching knees, and exhaustion likely accompanied many workers throughout adulthood. Still, rest remained limited for ordinary families. Survival required consistency. Food had to be prepared every day. Water carried every day. Fields maintained every day. Even during periods of peace and stability, life demanded continuous effort. And perhaps this constant effort itself helped create Egypt's social balance. People depended upon routines because routines helped them survive. Near the center of a larger town, a scribe sat inside a shaded administrative room surrounded by baskets filled with papyrus rolls. The smell of ink and dry reeds lingered in the warm air around him. Outside, the world felt bright and loud beneath the sun. Inside, the room remained cooler and dim. The scribe bent carefully over a document recording grain distributions from nearby storage buildings. His reed brush moved with practiced precision. Numbers mattered greatly. How much grain entered storage after harvest? How much had already been distributed to workers? How much remained for future shortages? A mistake could create serious problems later. So scribes learned patience and attention from an early age. Education in Egypt often emphasized discipline more than creativity. Young students copied texts repeatedly until symbols became automatic. Teachers expected obedience and careful memory. For ordinary farming families, literacy could open pathways toward safer and more respected positions within society. A successful scribe avoided some of the harshest physical labor of field work. Yet scribes themselves still lived structured and demanding lives. Long hours. Strict expectations. Constant record keeping. Order depended upon accurate administration. An Egyptian society valued order deeply. Not only visible order in buildings or ceremonies, but hidden order beneath daily life itself. Predictable harvests. Reliable storage systems. Clear social duties. Stable religious rituals. All these pieces work together quietly, like threads woven tightly into linen cloth. Outside the administrative building, market activity slowed beneath the afternoon heat. Merchants sat beneath shade coverings fanning themselves slowly while flies circled baskets of figs and onions. A butcher trimmed meat carefully beside hanging cuts already attracting insects in the warmth. The smells of the market shifted constantly. Fresh bread. Sweat. Fish drying in salt. Animals. Smoke. Spices from distant trade routes. Wet pottery cooling after firing. Voices drifted lazily through the heavy air. No one moved quickly now unless necessary. Even donkeys carrying supplies seemed slower beneath the crushing sun. Children rested indoors during these hours whenever possible. Many homes became unusually quiet in the afternoon heat. Infants slept while older family members repaired clothing, sorted grain, braided rope, or prepared ingredients for the evening meal. Domestic spaces in Egypt remained busy almost constantly. Small courtyards often served as centers of household activity. Here women baked bread, brewed beer, cleaned fish, washed linen, and cared for children beneath partial shade. Chickens wandered between baskets and clay jars while cats slept nearby against warm walls. The ordinary Egyptian home smelled strongly of life itself. Cooking fires. Stored grain. Dust. Oil. Wet clay. Sweat. River water. Simple homes carried few possessions compared to wealthy households, yet every object held importance. A damaged jar meant lost water storage. A torn basket affected food transport. Broken tools created serious difficulty. So people repaired items carefully whenever possible. Nothing useful was discarded easily. This careful use of resources helped communities survive difficult periods. By late afternoon, the sunlight softened slightly. A breeze moved across the Nile carrying cooler air inland from the water. Workers straightened slowly from their labor, stretching sore backs and shoulders after long hours beneath the heat. The relief felt gradual. Gentle. Like the land itself finally exhaling. In the fields, farmers gathered tools while birds descended upon recently disturbed soil searching for insects. Along the riverbanks, fishermen checked traps and prepared evening catches for transport home. The Nile changed color as the sun lowered westward. Bright white reflections softened into deep gold and bronze. Palm shadows stretched long across the water. Boats drifted quietly toward shore. This was often the most beautiful hour of the Egyptian day. Not because life suddenly became easy, but because the body finally relaxed slightly after enduring the heat. Evening allowed people to breathe differently. In one village, children ran laughing beside irrigation ditches while mothers called warnings from nearby doorways. Elderly men sat together beneath a tree discussing flood levels and local disputes in low tired voices. Nearby, a young laborer washed dust from his arms beside the river. Mud swirled gently away into the current while dragonflies hovered above the water nearby. Bathing in the Nile after work brought comfort beyond simple cleanliness. Cool water eased swollen feet. Relaxed aching muscles. Washed away the thick dust of roads and fields. For a few quiet moments, workers could simply stand beneath the evening sky and feel the river moving around them. Then slowly, village life shifted toward night again. Cooking fires brightened. Bread baked once more. The smell drifted softly through narrow paths between homes. Families gathered for the evening meal while daylight faded into softer shades of orange and blue. Meals remained simple for most people. Bread. Beer. Vegetables. Fish when available. Sometimes dates or figs. Meat more rarely. Yet after exhausting labor, even modest food brought comfort and stability. Children grew sleepy beside their parents while oil lamps flickered against mud walls. Conversation slowed. The tension of the day loosened little by little. Outside, the first stars appeared above the eastern desert. Temple bells sounded faintly in the distance from a larger settlement farther downriver. Priests there continued evening rituals beneath torchlight while incense drifted upward through stone halls. Religion quietly framed the entire rhythm of Egyptian life. Morning offerings. Midday prayers. Festival processions during sacred seasons. Burial ceremonies beside desert tombs. The gods seemed present in the flood waters, the sunlight, the harvests, and the movement of stars overhead. This spiritual structure helped reinforce social stability because it gave deeper meaning to ordinary routines. Planting grain mattered not only for survival, but for maintaining harmony with the natural order. Proper rituals mattered because balance between worlds mattered. Even rulers were judged partly by whether Egypt remained stable, fertile, and orderly under their care. As darkness fully returned, lamps glowed warmly across the villages beside the Nile. Workers rested upon rooftops beneath cooling air. Families settled into sleep. Far across the fields, insects sang softly in the reeds. And through the ancient night, the Nile continued its endless quiet journey northward beneath the stars. The stars above the Nile shimmered softly in the dark water below, broken gently by the slow movement of the current. The river never truly rested. Even in the quietest hours of the night, when villages slept and cooking fires cooled into gray ash, the Nile continued onward through the heart of Egypt, carrying reeds, drifting leaves, insects, fishing boats tied loosely to shore, and the reflections of distant torchlight from temple walls. Along the riverbanks, the night air felt softer now. The heat of the day had finally loosened its grip on the land. Mud brick walls released stored warmth slowly into the darkness while breezes moved through narrow alleys and across flat rooftops where many families slept together beneath the open sky. A baby stirred softly in sleep beside its mother. Nearby, an elderly man coughed once and turned upon his woven mat. A dog wandered silently through the empty street searching for scraps left behind from the evening meal. These quiet moments between midnight and dawn carried a strange kind of peace. The labor had paused. The shouting of merchants had faded. The grinding stones were silent for now. Only the insects, the river, and the wind still moved through the darkness. And beneath this calm surface, Egyptian society continued holding itself together through countless invisible threads of habit, duty, memory, and shared routine. The balance of Egypt did not depend entirely upon rulers or armies. It depended upon ordinary people trusting familiar systems. Trusting that flood waters would return. Trusting that grain would be stored. Trusting that neighbors would help repair damaged canals. Trusting that scribes would record harvests fairly. Trusting that tomorrow would resemble yesterday closely enough for life to continue. This trust created stability across generations. Before dawn, temple workers already began preparing for another day. Inside cool stone chambers lit by oil lamps, priests washed carefully in sacred pools before morning rituals. Incense smoke drifted through the halls in pale twisting lines while servants carried offerings of bread, fruit, beer, flowers, and clean water toward shrines hidden deeper within the temple. The outside world remained dark and silent, but the temples moved according to strict schedules tied closely to the rising sun. Order mattered greatly here. Every gesture repeated correctly. Every prayer spoken carefully. Every object placed where tradition required. To modern eyes, these rituals might appear distant or mysterious. But for ancient Egyptians, they formed part of the same balance that guided farming, trade, family life, and government. The world remained stable when proper rhythms continued uninterrupted. And so the temples never fully slept. Far from the temple walls, fishermen standing beside the Nile prepared nets beneath fading starlight. Their movements were quiet and practiced. Ropes slid through rough hands. Wooden boats rocked gently in shallow water. The smell of fish, wet wood, mud, and river plants filled the cool morning air. Some fishermen worked alone. Others worked beside brothers, sons, or longtime companions whose routines had become deeply familiar over years upon the river. Conversation stayed soft at this hour. The world still felt half asleep. Then slowly, the eastern horizon began turning pale. A thin line of silver appeared beyond the distant desert hills. Birds stirred among the reeds. Palm leaves rustled gently overhead. And once again, ancient Egypt awakened. The first grinding stones began their steady rhythm before sunrise fully arrived. Inside homes throughout the Nile Valley, women knelt beside low stones shaping grain into flour for bread. The movement was tiring but deeply familiar. Bodies remembered the work even while minds still felt heavy with sleep. Children blinked awake beside cooling walls. Small cooking fires crackled back to life. Smoke drifted upward through roof openings into the early morning sky. The smell of baking bread spread slowly through the villages. Bread remained at the center of Egyptian daily life in almost every social class. Rich households ate finer bread. Poorer families relied upon rougher grain mixed with other ingredients during difficult seasons. But everyone depended upon it. Workers carried bread into the fields. Boatmen ate bread beside the river. Temple offerings included bread. Families shared bread at evening meals. Grain and bread formed the quiet foundation beneath Egyptian civilization itself. And because food mattered so deeply, the systems protecting agriculture became essential to social balance. As sunlight finally touched the tops of palm trees beside the Nile, farmers moved steadily toward the fields. Morning remained precious. The air still felt cool enough for difficult labor. Sandals pressed softly into dusty roads while oxen snorted clouds of breath into the fading dawn air. Wooden tools rested across tired shoulders already preparing for another long day. The fields beside the Nile changed constantly with the seasons. After the floods receded, dark fertile soil covered the land in thick layers rich enough to support enormous harvests. During growing seasons, green crops stretched beside canals carrying water carefully through the fields. And during harvest itself, the entire landscape became busy with movement. Workers cut grain beneath the hot sun while others gathered stalks into bundles. Children helped carry smaller loads. Donkeys transported harvests toward storage areas where scribes waited to record totals carefully. Harvest season often brought both relief and anxiety. A strong harvest meant stability. Enough food for villages. Enough grain for taxes. Enough reserves for poor years ahead. But weak harvests created fear long before actual hunger arrived. The Egyptians understood how fragile balance could become if the Nile failed to flood properly. So they watched the river constantly. Measured it. Prayed beside it. Built systems around its rhythms. The Nile gave life, but life beside it required organization and cooperation. Near one canal, a group of laborers worked knee-deep in mud repairing damaged irrigation walls beneath the growing sunlight. Their legs and hands were coated with wet earth. Sweat mixed with river water across their backs and shoulders. The work was unpleasant. Heavy. Slow. But irrigation maintenance remained essential. Without functioning canals, crops failed. Without crops, stability weakened. And so communities organized labor together season after season to maintain the water system supporting their survival. Nearby, a village official stood beneath a shaded cloth watching the repairs while speaking quietly with a scribe recording labor assignments upon papyrus. Administration reached deeply into ordinary Egyptian life. Not always harshly. Often practically. Who owed seasonal labor? Which canals required repair first? How much grain had been harvested? How many workers were available for construction projects during flood season? These records allowed large populations to function with remarkable continuity across long stretches of time. By mid-morning, the villages along the Nile had fully awakened. Workshops opened their doors to the growing heat. Potters shaped clay vessels while spinning wheels turned steadily beneath practiced hands. The wet clay cooled the fingers briefly before drying beneath the warmth of the air. Nearby, carpenters shaved rough wood into smooth pieces for furniture, boats, tools, or storage chests. Wood remained valuable in Egypt, and skilled craftsmen wasted very little. The smell inside the workshops mixed together heavily. Clay dust, sawed wood, sweat, smoke from ovens, oil from lamps and tools. Voices rose and fell quietly over the steady sounds of labor. No one hurried unnecessarily. The Egyptian rhythm of work often felt measured rather than frantic. Tasks repeated carefully. Movements conserved energy. The heat itself encouraged patience. By noon, the sun blazed high above the Nile Valley once again. The brightness became difficult to look at directly. Stone surfaces reflected painful white light into the eyes. Roads emptied except for those whose work forced them outdoors during the hottest hours. Inside homes, shadows deepened against cool mud walls. Some workers rested briefly during midday if schedules allowed. Others continued despite exhaustion. Construction laborers hauling stone blocks or digging foundations beneath the sun endured especially difficult conditions. Their bodies strained constantly under enormous physical demands. Yet even these workers often lived within organized systems providing food, shelter, and scheduled labor rotations during large state projects. Egyptian society understood that maintaining order required feeding and managing workers consistently. A starving labor force threatened stability. So grain distributions, water supplies, and housing arrangements mattered greatly during major building projects. At one riverside dock, workers unloaded baskets of onions, dried fish, and pottery jars from a cargo boat arriving from farther south. Merchants checked goods carefully while scribes recorded transactions nearby. Trade moved steadily along the Nile every day. The river connected distant communities into a shared economic world. Goods traveled north and south with surprising efficiency for the ancient world because the Nile itself functioned as a natural highway through the center of the kingdom. Boat travel also carried news. Rumors from distant towns. Reports of flood levels. Announcements from officials. Stories of unusual events or changing conditions farther upriver. Even ordinary villagers often knew more about the larger kingdom than people in many other ancient societies because information moved steadily along the river routes. By late afternoon, the sunlight softened slightly again. A breeze drifted across the water carrying relief into the villages. Children emerged outdoors after resting during the hottest hours. Their voices echoed softly through narrow streets between mud brick homes while goats wandered lazily nearby. Women gathered water for evening meals. Smoke rose once more from cooking fires. The smell of bread returned to the air. Workers slowly made their way home from fields, workshops, docks, and construction sites with tired movements shaped by long labor. Some stopped beside the Nile to wash dust from their bodies before returning home. Others sat quietly in shaded areas simply resting for a few moments before evening responsibilities began. Even after full days of labor, household tasks still waited. Animals needed feeding. Tools needed repair. Food needed preparation. Children needed care. Life beside the Nile allowed little complete rest for ordinary families. Yet there remained warmth inside these evening routines. Neighbors spoke quietly together beside doorways. Families shared meals beneath soft lamplight. Stories passed from older generations to younger ones while darkness gathered slowly outside. And beyond the villages, beneath the first appearing stars, the Nile continued flowing calmly through the ancient land as it always had. The first stars reflected softly across the surface of the Nile while the last colors of sunset faded from the western sky. A deep blue darkness slowly settled over the riverbanks, over the fields, over the mud-brick villages where tired workers sat outside their homes enjoying the cooler evening air after another long day beneath the sun. The heat still lingered inside the walls and roads. Stone held warmth long after sunset. So people moved slowly now, allowing the night breeze from the river to cool their skin little by little. Near one small courtyard, a mother divided fresh bread among her children while smoke drifted upward from the cooking fire beside her. The bread was still warm from the oven. Nearby sat bowls of lentils, onions, and a small portion of dried fish shared carefully between family members. Meals in ordinary Egyptian homes were often simple, but evening carried a feeling of relief. The labor was finished. For a few hours at least. Tools had been set aside. Canal work had paused. The grinding stones were silent again. Bodies could finally rest. Children leaned sleepily against their parents while oil lamps flickered softly against mud walls. Outside, insects hummed beside irrigation ditches hidden in the darkness beyond the village. The calm of evening mattered greatly in Egypt. Without these quieter hours, the constant labor of daily life might have become unbearable. Even the poorest workers needed moments where the world softened. Moments where conversation slowed. Where tired feet cooled against packed earth floors. Where the sound of the river replaced the noise of labor. Along the Nile itself, fishermen prepared for another night upon the water. Some carried woven baskets and rolled nets toward narrow wooden boats tied beside the muddy banks. Others checked hooks, rope, and small oil lamps before pushing quietly away from shore. The river at night felt different from the river by day. More mysterious perhaps. But also calmer. The daytime traffic of merchants and cargo boats disappeared. Wind moved gently through the reeds. Moonlight spread silver patterns across the current. Fishing by night required patience and familiarity with the river's moods. The men moved carefully because they knew the water well. They knew where currents shifted unexpectedly. Where fish gathered. Where mud became dangerously soft near shore. Knowledge passed quietly from older fishermen to younger ones over many generations. Like so much in Egypt, survival depended upon memory and repetition. A father teaching his son where to cast a net. A mother teaching her daughter how to grind grain properly. An experienced farmer explaining canal repairs to younger workers. These small lessons help preserve stability across centuries. Most people in Egypt lived lives shaped heavily by inheritance. Not inheritance of wealth necessarily, though some families certainly possessed more than others. But inheritance of routine. Of trade. Of responsibility. Of knowledge tied closely to the land and river. Children grew into the work surrounding them. A child raised among fishermen learned the rhythms of the Nile. A child raised beside pottery workshops learned clay and fire. A child raised in scribal households learned writing and calculation. This continuity reduced uncertainty within society. People understood their expected roles early in life. And because many occupations passed through generations, communities maintained practical skills steadily over long periods of time. As full darkness covered the land, rooftops across the villages slowly filled with sleeping families. The night air above the houses moved more freely than the crowded rooms below. During hotter seasons especially, rooftops became important sleeping spaces where people rested beneath the stars. Woven mats covered flat roofs. Blankets lay folded nearby for cooler hours before dawn. Children pointed upward at the sky while grandparents quietly told stories passed down across generations. The stars held great meaning in ancient Egypt. Priests studied them carefully. Travelers navigated by them. Farmers connected seasonal changes to their movements. The night sky itself seemed ordered and dependable, much like the Nile. The Egyptians found comfort in this predictability. The sun rose. The river flooded. The stars returned each night. Order continued. And because the natural world appeared stable so often, people believed human society should reflect that same balance. Disorder frightened them deeply. Chaos meant hunger, violence, failed harvests, broken systems. So much of Egyptian life focused quietly on preserving harmony. Not perfect fairness. Not perfect peace. But continuity. Stability. The ability for life to continue tomorrow much as it had yesterday. Farther south along the Nile, near a larger temple complex, priests completed evening rituals beneath torchlight. The temple walls towered above dark courtyards decorated with carvings showing gods, offerings, harvests, river scenes, and royal ceremonies. Inside sacred chambers, incense drifted heavily through the warm air while chants echoed softly between stone columns. Temple life followed strict schedules every day. The gods received offerings in the morning. The gods received offerings at night. Sacred statues were cleaned and clothed carefully. Lamps were lit. Prayers repeated. Doors opened and closed according to ritual order. For ordinary Egyptians, these ceremonies reinforced the feeling that the world remained cared for, maintained, balanced. The temples also employed enormous numbers of ordinary workers. Cooks, sweepers, gardeners, scribes, bakers, brewers, musicians, laborers maintaining walls and storage rooms. Temple economies touched daily life in countless quiet ways. Nearby fields owned by temples produced grain for workers and rituals alike. Storehouses protected supplies against famine. Religious festivals distributed food and drink to large crowds during certain seasons. So even spiritual life connected directly to practical survival. Nothing existed entirely separate from daily labor beside the Nile. As midnight approached, the villages became quieter still. Only occasional sounds disturbed the darkness now. A coughing laborer turning in sleep. Soft footsteps passing along a road. A distant dog barking toward unseen movement beyond the fields. The smell of cooling earth rose gently into the night air. Somewhere beyond the cultivated land, desert winds moved across empty stone valleys beneath moonlight. Caravan routes crossed these distant spaces carrying trade goods between Egypt and foreign lands. Copper, gold, ivory, wood, perfumes, rare stones. Yet most ordinary villagers knew the desert only as a distant edge surrounding their fertile world beside the river. Their lives remained focused close to home. Close to the canals. Close to family. Close to the fields that demanded constant care. And perhaps this closeness helped maintain social balance too. Communities stayed rooted in familiar places. Neighbors knew one another well. Families often remained connected across many generations within the same villages or nearby regions. Shared memory strengthened cooperation. People remembered which families managed canal repairs responsibly. Which fishermen shared catches during difficult seasons. Which officials treated workers fairly. Trust developed slowly over time through repeated interaction. Before dawn, while stars still covered the sky, movement quietly returned again. A baker rose early to prepare ovens before the morning rush. Temple servants carried water through silent courtyards. Fishermen returned from nighttime work with nets heavy from the river. The cycle began again. Always again. Ancient Egypt endured partly because life moved in these repeating circles rather than sudden sharp changes. The floodwaters returned each year. Fields were planted again. Children grew into adults and inherited familiar responsibilities. Homes were repaired. Canals cleared. Bread baked. Records written. This repetition created resilience. Even when dynasties changed or distant rulers came and went, ordinary life beside the Nile often continued with surprising consistency. As dawn slowly brightened the eastern horizon once more, the villages awakened into soft gray light. Women rekindled cooking fires from buried coals saved overnight. Smoke curled upward through still morning air while grinding stones resumed their endless rhythm across the Nile Valley. Stone against grain. Grain becoming flour. The sound carried softly between homes. Nearby, a young boy carried water jars toward his family's courtyard while trying not to stumble in the half-darkness. His feet already knew the path from memory. A farmer stretched aching muscles before lifting tools onto his shoulder. An old woman swept dust from the doorway even though more dust would arrive again before midday. Small acts. Repeated endlessly. Yet together they formed the structure of an entire civilization. As sunlight touched the river, boats began moving once more along the Nile. Merchants loaded cargo. Fishermen sorted catches. Children chased birds from grain spread out to dry near the water. The smell of fresh bread drifted slowly across the village paths. Soon the heat would return. The labor would begin again. But for this brief hour before the full strength of day arrived, the world beside the Nile felt calm and almost gentle. Palm leaves rustled softly overhead. Cool shadows stretched across the earth. And the ancient river flowed onward through the waking land, patient and steady beneath the morning sky. Morning light spread slowly across the Nile Valley, soft at first, touching the tops of palm trees and the edges of mud brick rooftops before reaching the narrow streets below. The river reflected pale gold beneath the rising sun. Mist hovered low above the water in thin drifting layers that disappeared little by little as warmth returned to the land. Fishermen guided their boats toward shore after working through the cooler night hours. Nets heavy with fish rested in damp piles while birds circled overhead waiting for scraps. The villages awakened fully now. Doors opened. Cooking fires brightened. Voices drifted softly through courtyards. A donkey carrying empty baskets moved lazily down a dusty road while children stepped aside to let it pass. The beginning of the Egyptian day often felt calm despite the labor waiting ahead. For a short time before the full heat arrived, the world seemed almost quiet and gentle. Workers appreciated these hours deeply. A farmer walking toward the fields could still feel cool earth beneath his sandals. A woman carrying water jars from the canal still breathed air not yet thick with midday dust and heat. But everyone understood how quickly the day would grow harder. So labor began early. Near one farming village, men worked together clearing reeds from an irrigation channel clogged during the night. Mud covered their legs up to the knees. Mosquitoes drifted above the water beside them while the smell of wet earth filled the morning air. The canal had to remain clear. Water management shaped nearly every part of Egyptian survival. Without irrigation, crops weakened. Without crops, grain stores shrank. Without grain, stability disappeared. The people understood these connections clearly because they lived beside them every day. Nothing felt abstract. Every repaired canal meant food. Every healthy harvest meant safety. Every functioning storage house meant another season survived. And because survival depended upon cooperation, villages often organized labor collectively. One family alone could not maintain entire water systems. Communities had to work together. This shared responsibility helped create strong social bonds across generations. Nearby, a village official stood watching the canal repairs while speaking with a scribe recording labor participation. The scribe sat beneath a simple cloth canopy protecting him from the growing sunlight. His reed brush moved steadily across papyrus. Names, dates, measurements, assignments. The work appeared quiet and simple, yet it formed part of the invisible structure holding Egyptian society together. Records mattered greatly. Grain counts, tax payments, labor obligations, storage totals. Without organized administration, even fertile land beside the Nile could descend into disorder during difficult years. So scribes occupied an important place within Egyptian life. Not powerful in the way kings or generals were powerful, but necessary. Their careful records allowed systems to function smoothly across enormous distances. Farther downriver, market spaces slowly filled with activity as merchants arranged goods beneath woven shade coverings. Fresh onions, dates, clay jars, bundles of flax, fish packed in salt, linen cloth folded carefully against dust. The smells mixed heavily together beneath the warming air. Bread baking nearby. Animals. Smoke. River mud drying in the sun. Human sweat. The marketplace revealed the movement of daily Egyptian life more clearly than royal monuments ever could. Ordinary people negotiating over practical needs. A mother purchasing grain. A fisherman trading catches for tools. A potter delivering fresh storage jars. Children carrying bundles through crowded paths. The balance of society lived here too. In exchange. In routine. In steady predictable movement between people who depended upon one another. As the morning advanced, workshops throughout towns and villages grew louder with labor. Inside a pottery workshop near the riverbank, several workers shaped clay while large ovens radiated heat into already warming rooms. Wet clay cooled their hands briefly, though sweat soon covered their arms again. Pottery existed everywhere in Egypt. Storage jars, cooking bowls, beer containers, oil lamps, water vessels. The daily life of ordinary people depended constantly upon skilled craftsmen producing practical objects from river mud and fire. Nothing about the work appeared glamorous. The workers bent over clay for hours while dust settled into their hair and clothing. Yet their labor quietly supported entire communities. Nearby, weavers sat before wooden looms creating linen cloth thread by thread. Their fingers moved steadily through familiar motions learned since childhood. The room smelled of flax fibers and warm air trapped behind mud walls. Outside, sunlight grew brighter. Shadows shortened. The roads became hotter beneath bare feet and worn sandals. Egyptian cities and villages never fully escaped the presence of heat. It shaped architecture, work schedules, clothing, sleep patterns, even moods. During the hottest hours, conversation often slowed naturally. People conserved energy carefully because the body tired quickly beneath such conditions. Still, life continued. Near the edge of one village, a group of children gathered beside the river under the watchful eyes of older relatives washing clothing nearby. The children splashed in shallow water and chased one another through reeds while dragonflies hovered over the canal banks. Childhood in ancient Egypt carried both labor and freedom together. Children worked early. They learned responsibilities young. but they also found moments of play within the rhythms of village life. Simple games with carved pieces of wood. Running races along dusty roads. Swimming in quiet river shallows during hot afternoons. Listening to stories at night beneath the stars. The family stood at the center of Egyptian society. Not only emotionally. Practically. Families produced food, raised children, cared for elders, maintained homes, and passed knowledge across generations. Large households often included grandparents, relatives, servants, or laborers living close together within connected spaces. Privacy remained limited. Life unfolded communally. People slept close together. Worked close together. Ate close together. This closeness could create tension, of course. But it also strengthened mutual dependence. No one survived easily alone beside the Nile. By midday, the heat settled over Egypt once more like a heavy blanket. Air shimmered above roads and rooftops. Workers shaded their heads with cloth when possible. Animals rested beneath trees or beside walls where narrow strips of shadow offered relief. The brightness became almost painful. White limestone walls reflected sunlight sharply into tired eyes. Inside homes, cooler interior rooms provided brief escape from the worst heat. Women prepared food slowly while children rested nearby. Elderly family members often sat silently through these hours, conserving energy for evening tasks. Many ordinary Egyptians likely lived in a nearly constant state of physical fatigue. The labor was relentless. Grinding grain alone consumed enormous daily effort. Carrying water strained shoulders and backs. Farming demanded endless bending, lifting, digging, and hauling beneath intense sunlight. Even walking through thick heat exhausted the body. Yet people adapted. The rhythms of labor became familiar. Bodies hardened over years. Communities adjusted schedules around the climate. And slowly, quietly, life continued generation after generation. Near a large state construction site farther north, teams of laborers hauled stone blocks along prepared paths using ropes and wooden sleds. Sweat poured down their backs. Dust coated their skin. Foremen shouted instructions while scribes tracked supplies and labor assignments nearby. Large building projects required careful organization. Food deliveries. Water supplies. Housing. Tool maintenance. Medical care for injured workers. The Egyptian state developed strong administrative systems partly because such projects demanded coordination on enormous scales. Yet even here, ordinary labor remained the true foundation beneath the monuments. Hands lifting stone. Feet dragging sleds. Bodies enduring heat. The finished temples and tombs would survive thousands of years, but the workers themselves would mostly disappear into silence and dust. As afternoon slowly stretched onward, the pace of life softened again beneath exhaustion. Market noise quieted. Workshops slowed. Farmers paused beside canals drinking water from clay jars cooled in shaded mud. The Nile itself seemed calmer during these hours. Broad. Brown. Steady. Boats drifted quietly with the current while reeds moved gently in the hot wind. For many Egyptians, the river brought emotional comfort beyond practical survival. Its presence reassured them. The Nile returned each year. The floods returned. Life continued. Even during uncertain times, the river remained familiar. And familiarity itself became one of the deepest forms of stability within Egyptian society. Late in the afternoon, cooler breezes finally began moving inland from the water. Relief spread slowly across the villages. Children emerged from shaded interiors. Workers straightened tired backs. Voices grew slightly livelier again. The long difficult center of the day had passed. Along one narrow road, a group of laborers walked home carrying tools across their shoulders while dust rose softly around their feet. Their conversation remained quiet and tired. Ahead of them, smoke already rose from evening cooking fires. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the air once more. Women prepared lentils, onions, and fish while families gathered gradually near doorways and courtyards. Chickens scratched beside walls. Cats wandered hopefully near cooking areas. Evening returned gently to the Nile Valley. The harsh sunlight softened into deep gold. Palm shadows stretched long across fields and canals. Birds crossed the sky above the river in dark moving shapes. And slowly, as another day came to its quiet close, the ancient world beside the Nile began settling once more into calm darkness and rest. The evening sky above the Nile slowly deepened from gold into violet, and then into a soft dark blue scattered with the first quiet stars. Across the villages, the final warmth of the day drifted upward from stone paths and mud brick walls. The air still carried traces of smoke from cooking fires, baked grain from ovens, river mud, and dry reeds gathered beside the canals. Families settled into the slower rhythm of night. Workers washed dust from their feet using clay bowls of cool water near their doorways. Children leaned sleepily against parents while the last light faded beyond the western desert. Oil lamps flickered softly inside homes, turning rough walls golden in the darkness. These evening hours often brought the greatest peace to ordinary Egyptian life. Not because hardship disappeared. The labor waited again tomorrow. The heat would return. The canals would still require repair. But night allowed tired bodies to loosen slowly after carrying the weight of the day. Along one narrow village path, an old farmer sat quietly outside his home while night insects hummed beside the irrigation ditch nearby. His hands rested upon his knees, thick and rough from years of work beneath the sun. He had planted fields beside the Nile since childhood. He understood the smell of wet flood soil. The timing of river changes. The feeling of dry years before harvest even arrived. Knowledge like this lived inside ordinary people throughout Egypt. The civilization did not survive only because of rulers or priests. It survived because generations of workers learned the land deeply and passed that understanding carefully to those who came after them. Nearby, his grandson listened while shaping small figures from leftover mud beside the doorway. Children often learned simply by staying close. Watching. Listening. Repeating. The rhythms of Egyptian society entered the body through daily life itself. A young girl learned bread making by waking beside grinding stones before dawn. A boy learned irrigation work by walking canal paths with older laborers. Skills became memory through repetition over many years. And because these routines changed slowly across generations, Egyptian communities developed strong continuity over time. Inside the homes, evening meals continued quietly. Bread torn by hand. Bowls of lentils shared between family members. Fish roasted over low fires. Dates passed carefully to children. Beer poured from clay jars into simple cups. Meals were practical more than luxurious for most people, yet they also created moments of closeness within crowded lives. During the day, labor scattered people across fields, workshops, docks, and markets. At night, families gathered again. Stories were told softly. Problems discussed quietly. Tools repaired beside lamplight. Clothing stitched for another season of use. Outside, the Nile moved through darkness almost silently now. Moonlight spread across the water in long pale lines broken by reeds and drifting boats tied along the shore. Somewhere farther downriver, fishermen worked beneath the stars, their small lamps glowing faintly against the black surface of the current. Fishing remained difficult work despite the beauty of the river at night. Nets tore often. Storm winds sometimes rose unexpectedly. Crocodiles threatened southern regions. And yet the Nile fed countless communities through steady daily catches. Fish dried in salt became important food during seasons when other supplies grew uncertain. Nothing in Egypt depended entirely upon one source of survival. Balance came partly from variety. Farming, fishing, trade, storage, craft production, shared labor. All these systems supported one another quietly. Near a larger town farther north, temple musicians finished an evening ceremony while incense drifted through cool stone halls. The sound of drums and soft flutes faded slowly beneath towering columns carved with sacred symbols. Priests moved carefully through torch-lit corridors carrying offerings deeper into the temple complex. Religion in Egypt did not exist apart from ordinary life. It surrounded it gently. People prayed for healthy floods, for successful childbirth, for protection from illness, for enough grain to survive difficult seasons. The gods seemed present in every important part of existence. In sunlight, in river water, in fertile soil, in the stars crossing the night sky. And because religion reinforced ideas of balance and harmony, it strengthened social stability as well. The world functioned best when order remained intact. Each person had duties. Each season had rhythms. Each ritual had purpose. Disorder threatened not only governments, but the natural world itself. So ordinary Egyptians often viewed stability almost as a sacred responsibility. As the night deepened further, rooftops slowly filled with sleeping families beneath the cooler air. The flat roofs of Egyptian homes became important living spaces after sunset. During hot months especially, sleeping indoors could feel suffocating. So people carried woven mats upward by ladder each evening. There they rested beneath open skies filled with stars. The sounds of the village softened around them. Occasional voices drifted through darkness. A baby cried briefly. A donkey shifted somewhere nearby. Wind rustled palm leaves beside the canal. Then quiet returned again. The stars above Egypt appeared extraordinarily bright in the ancient world. Without lamps beyond villages or towns, the heavens stretched endlessly overhead. Priests studied constellations carefully, connecting celestial movements to religious calendars and agricultural seasons. Farmers too watched the skies. The appearance of certain stars helped signal flood seasons or planting times. Nature itself became a kind of calendar guiding the civilization forward. And because these natural cycles repeated reliably so often, the Egyptians developed deep emotional trust in continuity. The river would rise again. Fields would grow green again. Children would become adults and inherit familiar responsibilities. Life moved in circles rather than straight lines. This circular rhythm brought comfort. Even death became part of continuing cycles rather than final endings. The Egyptians prepared carefully for the afterlife because they believed existence continued beyond physical death. Tombs, burial rituals, offerings, and prayers all reflected desires for continuity and balance even after life ended. Of course, the wealthy prepared far grander tombs than ordinary laborers ever could. But many common families still honored the dead carefully. Simple burials, small offerings, quiet remembrance. The desire to remain connected to family and land stretched across every level of society. Far from the villages, beyond the fertile strip beside the river, the desert remained vast and silent beneath moonlight. Caravans traveling through distant trade routes moved slowly between wells and resting points. Their journeys connected Egypt to lands far beyond the Nile Valley. Gold from Nubia, wood from Lebanon, copper from Sinai, luxury goods from distant regions. Trade strengthened Egypt's economy and supported elite households, temples, and royal projects. Yet most ordinary people experienced these distant connections only indirectly. A foreign perfume in the market. A different kind of wood in a workshop. Stories told by merchants arriving on river boats. Daily life remained rooted locally for the majority of Egyptians. And local stability mattered most. As midnight slowly approached, the temperature cooled further. Some workers sleeping on rooftops pulled linen coverings across their shoulders against the night breeze. Nearby, oil lamps burned lower as families drifted deeper into sleep. The village seemed suspended between silence and the soft breathing of many sleeping people. Then, little by little, the night began turning toward morning once again. Temple workers stirred first. Then bakers. Then fishermen preparing nets beside the river. The cycle never truly stopped. Before dawn, one woman stepped quietly into her courtyard carrying grain for the morning meal. The stars still remained overhead. The air felt cool against her skin after the long heat of the previous day. She knelt beside the grinding stone and began the familiar motion once more. Forward. Back. Forward. Back. The sound echoed softly through the darkness. Soon other grinding stones answered across the village. One after another. A quiet rhythm spreading through Egypt before sunrise. Nearby, smoke rose from the first cooking fires. Children shifted awake beside sleeping mats. A rooster called from somewhere beyond the houses. And slowly, gently, ancient Egypt awakened once again beneath the fading stars. Along the riverbank, fishermen pushed boats into the water while mist hovered low above the Nile. Their oars cut through the calm surface without hurry. The eastern horizon brightened into pale silver. Palm trees emerged slowly from darkness. Birdsong returned to the reeds. Another day was beginning beside the ancient river. Another day of carrying water. Repairing canals. Writing records. Baking bread. Harvesting grain. Trading goods. Raising children. Resting tired bodies at night beneath the stars. And through these endless repeating acts, Egyptian society continued holding its balance quietly beside the Nile for century after century beneath the calm turning sky. The pale silver light of dawn spread softly across the Nile, and the river seemed almost motionless beneath the early morning sky. Mist drifted low above the water in long quiet bands. Reeds along the shoreline bent gently in the cool breeze. The world still felt half asleep. For a few precious moments before the full heat arrived, Egypt belonged to silence and soft movement. Fishermen guided narrow boats through shallow water while birds schemed low across the river surface searching for insects. Temple servants carried jars of water through shadowed courtyards. Bakers fed small fires beneath clay ovens while the smell of rising bread slowly filled the air. Then the grinding stones began again. The sound moved through villages like a familiar heartbeat. Stone against grain. Steady. Patient. Unchanging. Women bent over their work while children slowly woke nearby. Some homes remained dark except for the faint orange glow of cooking fires. Others had already opened their doors to the cool morning air. A young boy stepped outside carrying empty water jars balanced carefully against his side. Dust felt cold beneath his bare feet before sunrise. He moved quietly through narrow pathways toward the canal while dogs wandered lazily between homes still wrapped in shadow. The village itself seemed to wake gradually rather than all at once. A farmer coughing awake on a rooftop. A donkey shifting beneath its load. The creak of wooden doors opening. The low voices of neighbors greeting one another in the dawn. These small ordinary sounds formed the true rhythm of Egyptian life far more than royal ceremonies or temple festivals ever did. The balance of society lived inside these repeated mornings. Inside the simple fact that millions of people knew what the day required before the sun even rose. Near the fields, workers gathered early beside irrigation channels carrying wooden tools polished smooth by years of use. The canals reflected the brightening sky while water moved slowly between mud walls built and repaired across many generations. The irrigation systems of Egypt were never fully finished. Water constantly reshaped the land. Canal walls weakened. Floods changed pathways. Mud collapsed. So maintenance became endless. A farmer might spend much of his life repairing the same stretches of canal his father and grandfather once repaired before him. And still the work mattered deeply. Without water management, crops failed quickly beneath the Egyptian sun. So entire communities shared responsibility for keeping the canals functioning properly. One neglected section could affect many families. This shared dependence encouraged cooperation. Not perfect harmony always. Disputes certainly existed. Arguments over water access, land boundaries, tax burdens, labor demands. Yet the need for collective survival often pushed villages toward practical compromise because the river connected everyone together. As the sun slowly rose higher, warmth spread across the fields and roads once more. Workers moved carefully through rows of barley and emmer wheat while birds called overhead from palm groves beside the river. In some areas, harvest season had begun. Groups of laborers cut grain using curved sickles while others bundled stalks into stacks for transport. Harvest time changed the emotional feeling of the land. There was exhaustion, certainly. But also relief. Months of labor now became visible in the fields themselves. Golden grain beneath sunlight. Food for another year. Protection against hunger. Children sometimes helped gather loose stalks left behind after cutting. Elderly family members sorted grain in shaded courtyards while younger workers carried heavier loads toward storage buildings. Even very old or very young members of society often contributed something when possible. Egyptian life rarely allowed complete separation from work. The household itself functioned almost like a small economic unit where every person supported survival in some way. Near a riverside town farther north, merchants unloaded cargo boats arriving with pottery, fish, woven cloth, baskets, oils, and papyrus bundles stacked carefully beneath reed coverings. The docks smelled strongly of river mud and wet rope. Voices echoed across wooden walkways while scribes recorded incoming goods beneath shaded shelters. The Nile connected Egypt more efficiently than roads alone ever could. Travel by boat saved enormous labor. Heavy cargo floated instead of being dragged across dry land. Messages moved steadily between settlements. Trade strengthened local economies while helping distribute resources across the kingdom. And because the river flowed predictably through the center of the land, Egypt developed a sense of connectedness that many ancient civilizations lacked. A farmer in the south and a merchant in the north still shared the same river. The same flood cycles. The same dependence upon stable harvests. This common foundation helped reinforce cultural unity across long distances. Inside workshops near the docks, labor had already begun beneath the growing heat. A carpenter shaped imported cedar wood into furniture for a wealthy household. The smell of sawdust filled the warm room while sunlight entered through narrow openings high in the wall. Nearby, potters worked beside spinning wheels, their feet and hands coated in clay. Rows of finished jars stood drying in the sunlight outside. Every object required human effort. water jars, fishing nets, sandals, clothing, baskets, boats. Nothing appeared magically. The labor behind daily life remained visible everywhere in Egypt. And because most people lived close to survival itself, they understood the value of work deeply. A broken tool created serious difficulty. A failed crop threatened hunger. A damaged storage jar might mean lost grain. So care and maintenance became important habits throughout society. Objects were repaired repeatedly rather than discarded easily. Linen clothing was patched. Tools reshaped. Broken pottery reused. Waste carried risk in a world where labor required so much energy. By mid-morning, the sunlight intensified sharply. The cool softness of dawn disappeared beneath white heat pouring across the Nile Valley. Workers wrapped cloth around their heads or necks for protection while sweat darkened linen garments. The brightness itself could feel exhausting. Stone reflected sunlight upward into tired eyes. Dust rose beneath every passing footstep. Flies gathered around markets, animals, and cooking spaces. And still the work continued. Near one large granary, officials supervised grain deliveries arriving from nearby villages. Workers carried sacks through wide mud brick entrances while scribes sat nearby recording quantities carefully upon papyrus rolls. Granaries stood at the center of Egyptian stability. Stored grain protected against failed harvests and flood irregularities. It fed laborers during state projects. Supplied temples. Supported cities. Without organized food storage, even a fertile land beside the Nile could quickly become vulnerable. So administration mattered greatly. Not glamorous administration. Not dramatic. But careful. Measured. Patient. A civilization balanced over many centuries often depends more upon practical systems than heroic moments. And ancient Egypt understood systems very well. Inside homes during the hottest hours of the day, domestic labor continued steadily. Women brewed beer using grain mixtures prepared in large clay containers. Others baked bread, cleaned fish, washed linen beside canals, or cared for children sleeping in shaded rooms. The smell of baking grain and warm clay drifted through the villages. Cats slept beneath tables. Chickens wandered through courtyards. Flies buzzed lazily in the thick afternoon air. Many homes remained crowded and simple. Mud brick walls. Reed mats. Low stools. Storage jars lined carefully against walls. Yet these homes also held memory and continuity. Generations often lived close together. Children grew up hearing the same stories their parents once heard. Skills passed naturally through observation and repetition. A daughter learning weaving from her mother. A son learning canal work from older brothers. This continuity helped preserve social order because knowledge remained embedded inside family life itself. As afternoon deepened, the pace of labor softened slightly beneath exhaustion. Farmers paused briefly beneath trees or beside canals to drink water stored in shaded jars. Boatmen rested near the docks while warm wind moved across the river. The Nile itself seemed timeless during these hours. Wide. Brown. Steady. A slow-moving line of life through surrounding desert emptiness. The Egyptians likely felt emotional attachment to the river difficult for modern minds to fully understand. The Nile was not simply useful. It was constant. Familiar. Protective. Its yearly return shaped memory itself. People measured life through floods and harvests rather than numbered years alone. A child born during a strong flood season. A marriage after a successful harvest. A famine during years of weak water. The river lived inside personal memory as much as collective history. By late afternoon, cooler air finally drifted inland again. Children emerged outdoors laughing softly between homes. Workers returned slowly from fields and workshops carrying tools across tired shoulders. The village atmosphere changed gently. More relaxed now. Cooking fires brightened once more beneath clay ovens. The smell of bread spread through the evening air. Families gathered near doorways while palm shadows stretched long across the earth. Along the riverbank, fishermen repaired torn nets while watching the sun lower toward the western desert. Birds crossed above the water in dark graceful lines. Soon the stars would return. The rooftops would fill with sleeping families. The grinding stones would fall silent for a few short hours before beginning again at dawn. And the Nile would continue its endless patient journey through the quiet ancient land beneath the coming night. The night settles softly now across the Nile Valley. The last cooking fires fade into quiet orange embers beside the mud brick homes. Warm wind drifts slowly through the palm trees, carrying the smell of river water, baked earth, reeds, and cooling stone. The villages have grown silent. Fishermen rest beside tide boats along the dark shoreline. Farmers sleep heavily after long days beneath the sun. Children dream beneath linen blankets on rooftops where the night air moves gently under the stars. Far away, the temples stand still in the darkness. Their tall columns glow faintly beneath moonlight. The chants have ended. The lamps burn low. Even the priests have grown quiet now. And through the center of everything, the Nile continues flowing softly through the ancient land. Steady. Patient. Endless. For thousands of years, ordinary people lived beside this river. They woke before dawn. They carried water. They baked bread. They repaired canals. They raised children beneath the heat and dust of Egypt. Most of their names disappeared long ago. But their routines held the world together. A mother grinding grain before sunrise. A fisherman casting nets into dark water. A scribe recording grain stores by lamplight. A tired laborer resting beside the river at evening. Small lives. Quiet lives. Yet together they created one of the longest lasting civilizations in human history. Not through constant war. Not through endless power. But through rhythm. Balance. Patience. And the slow steady movement of daily life beside the Nile. Now the stars shine brightly above the sleeping river once more. The desert beyond the fields rests in deep silence. Palm leaves rustle softly in the warm night breeze. Somewhere in the darkness, water touches gently against the side of a wooden boat. And little by little, ancient Egypt drifts farther away into the quiet distance of history. The river keeps flowing. The night grows deeper. The lamps fade lower. And the old world beside the Nile slowly disappears into sleep.